And there you have it. Thanks for watching my Christmas cookie tutorial. For more easy cookie decorating, please subscribe to my channel.
The season to be jolly, fall. Hey, that looks awesome.
Really?
Yeah. You made those all by yourself?
Well, yeah.
Where'd you learn how to do it? You made those all by yourself?
I did. I was watching this YouTube video.
You're so good at decorating cookies. Come on, buddy. Hey, we should go caroling.
Makes you wonder, right? Should you even try? Good morning, first of all. Good to see all of you here this morning. Thanks for joining us online. I'm excited to start a new series today. And the question is, who needs Christmas? With all of the things that go on with Christmas, I mean, let's imagine and think about it together. You've got all of the lines you have to stand in. You have to fight traffic. You have to make sure you've got the list made. You have to make sure you fulfill all the things on the list. You have to make sure that everybody's going to show up when they're supposed to show up. You're hoping the packages you ordered on, one of the delivery services, they show up on time. I'm still waiting for one that was supposed to show up 2 days ago. You can imagine, right, of what all of these things that go on. And then on top of that, trying to get your family together and making sure everybody's getting along and making sure that you've got all the details in place and that the food is just right and the decorations look just the way you want them. And it's almost to the point, it's like, who needs all this? Who needs this to be the thing? I want to ask you that big question today, and I want you to consider this. Not about all of the details like that of Christmas, but I want to go back to really what we talk about. When we think of Christmas, who really needs it? Who needs what Christmas is and what it's all about? We all have ideas in our minds of the story that we've all heard in the past, the idea of this, and it comes down to these things that we want to make sure we do and traditions that we fulfill and all of that, or it just won't seem like Christmas. But I want to encourage you to consider this. Who needs Christmas? Where did it come from? Why did it happen? What's all of this? And I want to take you back to what we would normally talk about. At a time like this, everyone knows the Christmas story. The story of Mary and Joseph and the little baby that was born, Jesus, and he was born in Bethlehem, and there were angels and shepherds and all of the things that go with it. The manger and the cattle lowing, whatever that is. And we all have this idea of Christmas and what it looks like and maybe the details of what we think of when we think of that story and how it all came together. But I want to take you to a place today to consider something that maybe it's not just that story. Matter of fact, it actually, I believe, doesn't start with just Mary and Joseph. The story goes back almost 2,100 years before Jesus was ever born. That's when we hear about another couple, a couple that was considering the fact that they couldn't even have children, had never had children. They were well up in years and had never had a baby. And we go into this ancient document to see this account of their lives. Matter of fact, that ancient document is something that we can really hang on to and know that it's full of truth because it was actually used for years and it was passed down and then became finally a part of what we regard as the Old Testament and then was put together with the New Testament so we can see the whole story. And so we start today not with the Christmas story of Mary and Joseph, but the backstory, the beginning of the Christmas story. And we go back to this ancient document called Genesis. It was one that, and if you are skeptical of Scripture, you're ever skeptical of the Bible or what it says, or you're having a hard time believing some of the things that are there, you can believe this for sure, that something like this, a document, has lasted for years. And it's been a foundation for the people of Israel and the Jewish people for hundreds of years. That they have based their whole belief system on this. And so it's so important, this ancient document, the ancient document of Genesis. And so I'm excited to take you there to show you this couple that had not had children, could not have children, and now up to this point, they are looking for what God wants in their life, and they had heard of Him, and they maybe have been trying to be in touch with Him because they've seen some of these stories passed on and traditions that have been in place, but they were living in a place that we all know of today as Iraq. They were living just north of the country of Kuwait in Iraq, the little town of Ur. We're going to go to Genesis to begin this backstory of the Christmas story. And I want you to go there. It's Genesis chapter 1. And we find out about a man by the name of Abram. And Abram, actually, his name has changed, and we know him mostly as Abraham. A lot of us who grew up going to church, we remember the song. Remember? Father Abraham had many sons, and many sons had Father Abraham. And then you did a bunch of motions that didn't make any sense. Right? But that's kind of what we think of. And we think of Abram being this man who was then living in this town of Ur, and he gets a communication from God Himself. A communication that reaches out to him and speaks to him right where he was. Now let me tell you about what the world was like at that time. The world was made up of people that were clustered in their families and in their tribes, their clans, people that had kind of made pacts together with each other. And there wasn't a lot of respect for that or borders or anything. As a matter of fact, it was so difficult that people, you didn't get along with other nations. Matter of fact, or nations or countries or groups or tribes of people, you didn't think of them as allies. You thought of them as people that had possessions and resources that you needed, that you would go after and bring in for yourself. So that's kind of what the world was like. And so we pick it up here where God speaks to Abraham, we'll call him throughout this time. And this is what He says to him. God says this directly to him, and He speaks to him to get his attention, and He gives him something that's pretty big. Matter of fact, it really sets up what we know as the Christmas story. It starts out like this. The Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you." When you see these statements, God was asking Abram to give up everything that he had. He was asking this man that would later be known as Abraham, he was asking him to give up this area that he had lived in, his country. He had the surroundings that he lived in. He asked him to give up his people, all these people that he had made some alliances with, or his tribe, or these people he had gotten used to living around or with. And he asked him to give up his father's household, because that was a big part of this. A father would have his country, his land, what he owned, and he would pass it on to his family members. And so that was what it was about. And God says, I'm asking you to leave all of that, to go to a land that I will show you. I don't know how you feel about it, but I like to know plans ahead of time. I don't like to just pick up and pack a U-Haul and head off and not know where I'm going to live. Not have any idea of it. Just, there's a promise that there will be a place where you can go. Once you get there, I'll show you how to get there. I'll show you where it is. But I'm asking you to give up all of these securities and certainties that you have, your safety, and I'm asking you to move on. And this is exactly what it turns out to be. Now, God gives him this promise. Look at how it develops. He not only tells him to get up and go and to leave, but He gives him something as a part of it. He says, I will make you into a great nation. Now remember, Abraham didn't have any children, but he was going to be made a great nation. Back in those days, a nation came from a family. It came from two people who would have children, and then they would have children, and they would have children. There would be many descendants, and that's what would turn into a nation or a country or a group of people. And he had no children. Late, probably in his 70s at this time when this was given to him, around 2,100 years before Jesus was born. We're thinking it was probably around 2090 BC. When this took place. Not only did he say you'd be a great nation, but you will bless, and I will bless you. Meaning God was going to give him everything that he would need, give him everything possible for him to be able to succeed. He would be on his side. He would take care of him. When God blesses, he takes care of those he has promised to. And then it says, I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. He's going to make his name great. In other words, what he was forming, everything that Abraham was, he was going to turn him into this large nation. He was going to bless him. He was going to make him famous and well known. But it goes on. This is a big promise to somebody who had no children that he was going to have this. And it goes on. It says, I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. Meaning that he was going to take care of him. Not only was he going to take care of those that were around him, that would bless him and take care of him and keep them strong, but he was also going to take care and protect him for those who would curse him and come against him. God was going to be there throughout all of that and take care of him. And all peoples on earth, this is the biggest promise of all. Here was something that was not promised at all to anyone up to this point. No one in history had ever been given a promise like this, and especially from God himself. He says, you will have all of this opportunity, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. All peoples, meaning every nation. It trickles all the way down through history. Everyone who has ever been around, including us here today. Think about this. All people would be blessed through you, Abraham. Through you. You might say, okay, Greg, I'm good. I want to hear Christmas. Okay, well, I'm telling you, this is part of the backstory. This is where it all began. A promise that God gave Abraham that he would be a great nation, that he would bless him, that he would watch out and protect him. He would bring people around him that would support him. He would also make sure that he would be a blessing to all peoples. This was quite a legacy because this was not something that normally happened. All right? This was not something that was going on among the nations that existed at the time. And to have a promise like this was completely different. Nations never blessed other nations. Nations never blessed other nations. There was no promise from that. They would make alliances. There was lots of people coming in and conquering and stealing and taking away from each other. They never thought of how they might creatively make resources shared with other countries. They would just go in and take them over to steal and to rob and to take those away. That was usually how these groups would work together at that time. They didn't. And so at this point, when you think about it, that nations never blessed other nations, that's a difficult circumstance to begin a nation in. A promise that was given. Now, I want to take you to this because I think this will help it all kind of flow and you can see how it takes on. So I'm going to encourage you to use the seat belts we've installed on the chairs as we fly through a lot of history here in the next few minutes. I want to take you to a timeline and I want to show you this. Abraham, around 2090 BC, is when he got this promise from God. And Abraham was married to Sarah. And so we know that within a period of time, they got sidetracked. They made a huge mistake. They didn't pay attention to what God had promised. And then they had to live with the consequences of that. So every time we see a person like Abraham or Moses or David, sometimes it makes us skeptical maybe of the stories because we see this and we think to ourselves, these people were the great people of God and they were the ones we should trust them and know that what they said and their example we can follow. But what we forget is they were human. They were human. They made mistakes. They were sinful. These people, every one of them, just because their story is recorded in the Bible does not mean that they were perfect or it was exactly what God would have wanted to happen. These people made decisions on their own, and so the decisions they made were part of the story. And Abraham made some bad decisions. He made some decisions that affected them. And then here he is. Later, he has not this one child that is going to become this great nation. His wife Sarah and him, they are nearing their 90s, if not already in their 90s. Now, I don't know if we have the privilege of having anybody here or watching today that's in their late 80s or 90s, but I want to tell you this. Can imagine getting the news. You know, ladies, 90-year-old lady, you're pregnant. Wow. You know? And imagine, this idea of this. So they never thought this was possible. Here was a promise that there was going to be a great nation come from them, but they didn't think it would happen. But later in life, they heard from a messenger that Sarah was going to have a baby. She was going to give birth to their son, Isaac. And Isaac was this one that was promised. They couldn't wait for him, obviously. God tested them about whether or not they really meant and that Abraham was true to follow him, even with the life of Isaac himself. And then Isaac grows up and he has two sons. One was Esau and one was Jacob. Esau actually should be the one up here because he was the firstborn of the two. Esau would have been here, except he sold his birthright to Jacob for a bowl of soup. That's got to be some soup, you know? But he didn't realize, he didn't have the idea and didn't really take seriously the promise that God had made, and he gave up his birthright to Jacob. And then Jacob grows up, and Jacob has these 12 sons. Now imagine, I don't know, my dad grew up in a family of 8 boys. My wife's dad grew up in a family of 8 boys. 8 in itself is enough, right? But imagine 12. Well, all the dysfunction that you would think would be in any family that large was there. Matter of fact, those boys, 11 of them, decided to throw their youngest brother, Joseph, in the well and sell him off into slavery. Now, you can imagine this broke Jacob's heart because they told him that he had been killed. Imagine what that dysfunction was like in that family at that point. But what happens to this one that is sold into slavery, and we know his name was Joseph, we know that this is where the beginnings of them going into Egypt. He was sold into slavery, but then brought in, and he began to be a leader in Egypt because he was smart and he was bright. And because God had kept his promise and had a way of delivering them all the way through this, even though it seemed like it was hopeless, even for Joseph, and this family had been torn apart out of jealousy from these brothers, what happens? God still uses those mistakes and those things that were problems. He brings it all together and ends up Joseph as a leader then finally in Egypt. He invites his whole family, including his father, brings them to Egypt because there was famine back in the land where they were living. So while they're there, they're being taken care of. They begin to grow as a nation. They begin to grow and they begin to have many children. And as they have these children, what happens is Pharaoh looks at them. Pharaoh from Egypt looks and says, this is going to be a problem. This many people are going to take over Egypt if we don't do something about it. And what's he do? He turns them into slaves to do his bidding during that time. And so they become enslaved. Imagine, they begin to be a nation and then they become slaves. This promise seems like it never comes about. It seems like there would be something. This is why it's so remarkable, why it's so inconceivable of the Christmas story when you see the backstory of how it starts to flow and it starts to come together, and you see these people linked and how God kept his promise even through all of this. But it doesn't seem like that now, does it? Here they are. So what happens? God sends a deliverer. His name is Moses. Moses comes on the scene, and what's he do? He becomes this one empowered by God to lead these people out of their slavery to Egypt. They go into this area to go to this promised land that God had said, I'm going to give this to you. I want you to take them there, Moses. And as he does, that's where we find out that the group comes up to the place where they could enter. They cross the Red Sea. They do all these things that miraculously God takes care of them in. They come up to this place where it's time to go into the land, and they send 10 men in. Actually, send 12 men in. 10 come out. And what happens? They say, no, it's a great place, but we can't overcome the problems. 2 of them said, let's go. And so what happens? Moses listens to the 10, and they start to walk away from the entrance, basically, into this promised land that God had given them. And what happened at that point? God caused them to wander in the wilderness for 40 years because they didn't obey and listen to God. Here, story full of the promise that's there, but yet people making decisions and things that were causing mistakes and keeping them from doing and experiencing what God. So while they're wandering during this wilderness, God gives them this law, the 10 commandments, and gives them all this explanation of how that they were to worship Him and what they were to do. And during that time, it comes down to the end, and Moses, in his life, he disobeyed God and did something directly. He wasn't even allowed to go into the promised land at the end of that 40 years. He passes the baton on to Joshua, and Joshua becomes this one to take them into this new land and to overcome the area and to start to take possession of it. And they run into people who are completely godless, wanted nothing to do with God. And in that time, it was so difficult and so hard, but yet Joshua stayed focused, and they came to that point. During that period of time, they began to grow and they began to establish themselves in there. The problem was that they were leaderless, and the leaders that were there were called judges, and those judges would try to bring people back. They would follow God, and then they would give up on God, and then they would follow God, and they would give up on God, mostly because their whole saying for their life, their motto was, do what's right in your own eyes. Sound familiar at all? You know? You ever see any of that happening? Of course. But as the time progresses, they find a leader. And this leader is established and anointed by God to be in place, and his name is David. Now, David wasn't perfect, but he was that first king of Israel that truly followed God. There was one before him, Saul, but he didn't fully follow God. David was the anointed one, the one that God wanted in place, because we'll find out how important David is to the Christmas story in just a minute. As we see the backstory continue to develop, David took charge and he built a military. He began to make alliances. He began to do things necessary to be a strong nation. And finally, the promise seems like it's coming to be. He has a son by the name of Solomon. And Solomon then takes over and he builds this large temple to worship God, a place that many people from all the nations came to see who this God was that they were worshiping. And as they were doing this, Solomon then begins to see the peak of the performance of the nation and how great it could be. And he begins to say on his own, I think I'm going to come up with my own plan. And so he starts to marry many of the women from the other nations. Matter of fact, the family members, daughters of the kings of those other nations. And he brings them into his family. And as he does this, it begins to be a watered down concept of who God was, and he began to worship all the gods of all these women that he was marrying. And so they started to decline. And as they declined, at the time Solomon ends his reign and others start to take over, there was a great division that happened in Israel. And there was the northern kingdom, this northern group of people that was known in that day as Israel. And they, beginning right from the beginning, decided not to follow God at all. The leaders that they established for the northern kingdom, they decided to give up on God completely. The southern kingdom, which we know as Judah, Judah was reigned by kings up and down roller coaster of whether they would follow God or not. And all during that period, this kingdom divided was not pointing them toward promise. You didn't see it. It seemed impossible. It seemed like it was unbelievable. That's what makes this story so inconceivable, that it could actually lead to such a great promise. Where was the promise that Abraham gave him? What was going to happen? How was this all going to come about? Now this kingdom, no way they could be a blessing to all the nations. They could barely hold themselves together. They couldn't agree. They couldn't stay focused. And then, during that period, God raises up men to be these preachers, speaking on God's behalf and saying things that sometimes were very unpopular, but they said the things that needed to be said based on what God wanted the people to know and to be reminded of. And Isaiah was one of them. Isaiah, actually, he says this during this period of time. He writes this out on behalf of God. He gives this to them. I will also make you a light for the Gentiles. Are you kidding me? You're going to make this nation that's divided right now, that has no semblance, no order, an up and down ride of whether they believe in God or not. Some of them have completely given up on God. You're going to make them a light for the Gentiles? But Isaiah says it clearly, words from God himself, that my salvation may reach to the ends of the earth. Salvation? They couldn't even save themselves. During this time of division, other nations started to look at them and say, we might be able to take advantage of them and take over this country. We might be able to take their resources. We're not afraid of their God any longer. This God that during the reign of David and others seemed so strong, and now he seems weak and impotent. So now what happens? This one that Isaiah promises, looking at the situation and the circumstance, it all seemed hopeless. It all seemed hopeless. A divided kingdom, but here this prophet speaking on God's behalf. You're going to be able to pull all the nations together. You're going to do something for them that they never expected. It's going to be amazing. Imagine being one of the people and hearing Isaiah say this and wondering, how is that going to happen? How could that even come to be? Well, then as the time progresses, the northern kingdom, they are overtaken by the Assyrians. And the Assyrians take them into slavery. They disperse them all over the world at that point, the known world. And as they meet these, it basically just, it disintegrated the entire northern kingdom. They just didn't exist anymore because they were sent all over the place. They started to be there and marrying the people from the other nations and having children. And then the whole idea of having a nation was destroyed for the northern kingdom. And then you have the southern kingdom that they hung in there for a period of time, but they became anemic. And Nebuchadnezzar from Babylon knew that, and he came in, and what did he do? He took over what was going on there. And he comes in and he tears down the walls of Jerusalem, and he tears down the temple that Solomon had built toward God. And then what happens? Of all of this, he takes the greatest and best leaders that existed right then in Judah, and he takes them, like Daniel, and takes them back to Babylon, leaving just a few people, no military, very insecure, unsafe. This was the group that was promised, you will be a great nation and you will bless other nations. And now they're enslaved. Part of it is completely destroyed. There's not even a nation anymore, and now the others are there. And imagine this. Over the period of time, the Persians come in, and then the Greeks begin to take some strength and begin to gain strength in the world. And there was a man, another prophet, who rose to the occasion and started to speak on behalf of God, and his name was Malachi. And this is what Malachi said. My name, and he's speaking on behalf of God, remember, my name will be great among the nations. God proclaiming that his name would be great. And he had promised all of this, but yet it didn't seem like that was going to happen, did it? It sure didn't seem like it was going to come together. How in the world was his name going to be great among the nations from where the sun rises to where it sets? Meaning all around the world, God, his name would be great and honored. But then it goes on, and even in the statement it says, in every place incense and pure offerings will be brought to me because my name will be great among the nations, says the Lord Almighty. When he signs this statement, the Lord Almighty, that is the greatest signature God puts on it. It's the greatest and most powerful example of who he is in just his name, the Lord Almighty. My name will be great among the nations. It wasn't great at this point. Not great at all. Matter of fact, shortly after this, you can imagine that the people begin to see this promise that had been given to Abraham, this promise seemed unbelievable, it seemed impossible and inconceivable that it could even happen. That's what makes the Christmas story so remarkable, that it could even happen. All of this coming apart, the promise seemed unbelievable, impossible, inconceivable that it could even happen. You'll be a great nation. You'll be blessed. You'll be protected. You're going to bless all the nations of the world. You're going to pull all the Gentile nations together and bless them. How is this going to happen? Because shortly after this, not only did the Greeks start to come in, but they appointed Alexander the Great, who then started to pull things together and overcome all of this region and area. And then shortly after that, Pompey the Great from the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire had started to take power and was beginning to grow in strength. And Pompey the Great comes into Jerusalem. He takes it over, and what takes place at that point? Rome owns the God of Israel, at least in their thinking. God owns the place, the city of God. He owns everything. Rome now has it all. It's in their possession. Now, if you think that that's over, imagine this. During that period of time, there was 400 years then that spanned from that period up until we hear the first inklings of anything from God. 400 years of what's called now as silence, but really we know that it was people passing the message on, faithful people that believed in God and believed that that promise would happen. And there were faithful people like the ones we think of in the story that we talk about at Christmas. What happens is even the way that Rome takes over, it sets everything up. You could see that God had a hand in bringing it all together. And so what happens? In Galatians chapter 4, Paul actually captures it this way. He says, "But when the set time had fully come, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law." When God had everything timed out just the way he wanted it, he brings about the Son of God coming to earth. That's when he's born. Things like the Roman Empire brought common roads for everything, connected highway systems. They brought a connected language that everyone in every nation in that known world at the time spoke together. Common currency, where money that was used was all the same throughout the Roman Empire. Imagine, all of these things was just exactly what God was wanting. And you know when we think sometimes God's timing's way off and that he doesn't know, he's bringing everything together? Ever thought that you were promised something and you never thought that God would come through? You never thought that it would be possible for God to see through your mistakes and the things that have happened in your life, and you thought, there's no way God's going to see me through this. He's not going to protect me. He's not going to help me. We will believe some of those kind of things, but I want to show you this. This is so critical because the people could have easily given up. Many of them did. But the promise that God made Abraham 2,000 years before this, let me just tell you this. Nothing changes God's promises. In all the chaos and all of the things that were going on in the world, everything that had been down, all the way down to the single mistakes that individuals made that caused disarray and problems within the nation, all of that, even for their own lives, the dysfunction within the families, all of this that was going on, God still, his promise never changed. That there would be a great nation and that it would bless all of the people, everyone, all the way down to us here today. Every one of us, any of us are included in that. What is great is then we go to this, and finally, those of you who have been waiting all morning, here it is. You go to Luke chapter 1, and we find out that actually the birth of Jesus, not that it's not an important event, it is very important, but it leads to an event that is the greatest event in history. It's when Jesus grew up as a man and he died taking on our sin and paying the penalty for that. And if we believe in that and trust, our sins can be forgiven. But then the real hope is the fact that not only did he die, he rose from the dead, the greatest event in history. And it all led to this point. And so only Matthew and Luke capture the birth of Jesus. Not even Mark or John even mention it. But all four mention the resurrection. So as we look at this, it's amazing. In the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy, Elizabeth was a family member, a little more detail to just show the authenticity of the story. God sent the angel Gabriel to Nazareth, a town in Galilee, to a virgin pledged to be married to a man named Joseph, a descendant of who? David. Do you see how it's coming together? You see this backstory that we saw before? Now the threads come together. And look at this. The descendant of David, the virgin's name was Mary. This one that everybody knows Mary's name, right? Everybody knows that. Even if you're not familiar with church or you don't, everybody recognizes the name Mary. She was the one who was a descendant. So was Joseph. It all comes through this. And they were descendants of David. That promise was coming through. And then the story goes on. And then the angel went to her and said, "Greetings, you who are highly favored. The Lord is with you." Mary was chosen just like Abraham was chosen, just like Isaac and Jacob and all of these people that we see in the story. And you know what's really great about it? Every person has that stamp. If you know Jesus or you know who he is, know this, that he's chosen you. He knows you. He knows every detail about your life, just like he knew their lives. And she was highly favored. That's why she was chosen. That's why she was picked. And he says, "The Lord is with you," to her. But then the story goes on, and this is amazing. Mary was greatly troubled at his words and wondered what kind of greeting this might be. Yeah, an angel shows up at your house, you're going to be a little troubled. But the angel said to her, "Do not be afraid, Mary. You have found favor with God." And then verse 31, look at this. This is great. "You will conceive and give birth to a son, and you are to call him Jesus." The promise is realized. The promise is finally here. This promise of this one would bless every nation. Why? Because he was there, and the whole idea of his name, you'll call him Jesus because he came to save the people from their sin. That's amazing. I mean, the backstory was so long and drawn out, and it seems like that for us at times, doesn't it? So difficult and hard to go through life, but then you see how God weaves in and out these things that are amazing. And you can't dismiss it when you see that it took years. Nobody could make the story up. This is history. This is what happened, how it came all the way to this one being born, Jesus. And I love this. The verses continue to even emphasize the backstory. "He will be great and be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father, David." He's now the one in charge. He's the one ruling. He's the one bringing the great nation. And he will reign over Jacob's descendants. Remember all those dysfunctional boys that had kids and then had kids and then had kids? Jesus is the one reigning over them. And this is what's great. The final just exclamation point on the whole passage. His kingdom will never end. Great nation? Oh yeah. Being able to bless all peoples? Oh yeah. Absolutely. And this is what is great about this. Because if it hadn't been for this incredible backstory, the proof and evidence that just is overwhelming for what seems to be an impossible, inconceivable story, God brings together this promise that was given to Abraham 2,100 years before Jesus was ever born. And yet he fulfills it. And then Jesus continues his life here. He dies for sin and then raises from the dead. It's an amazing thing. That never ends. You know what's really great about it? God never breaks a promise. Never breaks a promise. And not only does he never break a promise, but this is evidence to me when I watch this. If God is telling us something that he is going to do for us or he's going to do for you, he promises over and over again that he's going to love and he's going to take care of. He's going to do the things necessary. He's going to give you forgiveness. He's going to keep that promise. And it's also evidence that God is actively working throughout all of it, even during the tough times and the circumstances that seem so hard to overcome. What took place? God was actively working all the time, bringing it about. He had never given up on this group of people. He never had second thoughts about whether he cared for them or loved them. He was always there. God is always actively working. In your life and in my life, he is always actively working. If you think that God has given up on you, he hasn't. He's given you a great promise. He sent Jesus so that you would have life eternal. Think about this. Amazing story that God weaved together, and all through it, he is actively working. And in our world today, he's actively working. In your life today, he's actively working. In my life today, I'm so thankful he's working in our lives. But not only that, God can be trusted. He can be trusted with whatever circumstance we're going through. No matter what we face, no matter what the most hardship we may have in front of us, even in the times of being on good ground and everything seems like it's coming together, even in all of that, he's there and can be trusted. God could be trusted throughout all that was stated through that whole history, the backstory to the Christmas story. So I ask you, who needs Christmas? The world. The world needed a great nation, a promise from a God who could bring about a blessing to all people. What a great thing to know. Who needs Christmas? The world. He fulfilled his promise to make sure that happened. I want to encourage you to think about what God has done and that backstory that just came together with his hand guiding it, never giving up, always keeping his promise. What an incredible thought.